Welcome back, guys. We are here for the Phyrexia All Will Be One set review. And as always, we've got Yanks on the line. Welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
For our first segment here, we're actually just going to be doing an introduction to All Will Be One. This is going to be going over new mechanics, returning mechanics, cycles, and the different draftable archetypes in the format. This is a limited-oriented set review, so we won't be talking about anything in regards to Commander or Constructed in any way. So, just kind of keep that in mind as we go through the set review. Each color will follow along with this set review, and we will give everything a rating between 1 and 5, depending on how powerful we think it will be in the average limited deck. So let's go ahead and start with the first new mechanic, Toxic. So I went ahead and picked one of these simple cards. Again, we're not going to rate these because that'll come later in the show, but we're going to talk a little bit about what the mechanic is and sort of simplify it so that way when we get into the actual cards themselves, it's a little easier to handle. So we have Toxic here, and it says, the Duelist of the Deep. Toxic 1, players dealt combat damage by this creature also get a poison counter. As long as it's your turn, Duelist of the Deep Faith has first strike. So, Yanks, this is a little bit different than poison counters. You wanna give us your thoughts here on Toxic? I feel like you have a lot to say on this one.
Well, first up, this is like the third different way they've tried to do poison counters. So before you had any key, or fourth if you count, or like early Magic where you didn't even have a keyword and it just said poison counters. But so everybody knows, people know Infect. That you don't take regular damage, you just take damage equal to the creature's power in the form of poison counters.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Poisonous and Toxic, which are almost identical. The only difference between the two is that Poisonous created a trigger, where Toxic just happens at the same time as damage, kind of like life. So like Spirit Link was an old card that effectively gave a creature lifelink, but it was a trigger instead of actually just happening at the same time, with which lifelink matters a lot because you might take lethal before you can gain that life back to keep you. It's very rare it's going to come up with poison counters. In fact, the literal only reason they changed this mechanic, and this is just one of those things, they make things more confusing in my mind, the only reason they changed it is to remove clicks on digital.
Okay. Yeah, we see that a lot more with each opponent is a thing that we're seeing more of to lower that, to make, arena smoother and easier. I don't know if that's the case here, but
I mean, Mark Rosewater said that. He didn't say it was the only reason, but that was a key consideration in why this way.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to them trying to try new things that make things just better in general.
I generally agree. I don't when it just adds more complexity to the game by creating two things that are almost the same but not quite. That confuses people.
Yeah, but if the goal is to ultimately switch to the new version of things that is, like you said, they're almost the same thing. One is easier for arena and doesn't make paper more difficult, then I can see that being a thing. Now I don't know if this makes things more difficult, but maybe if the idea is to switch to this sort of like stun counters, right? Doesn't untap. They're changing that to a single stun counter now, right?
Yeah, to me it feels a lot like the change, and maybe it was a good change, but the change in werewolves, where now if you have old werewolves and new werewolves on the field at the same time, they're all completely desynced and all over the place, and no one has any idea what's going on.
Yeah, and that's a thing between the two that are significantly worse, but I don't know if that's a good argument to try not to ever improve anything, because I do think the new werewolf cycle is substantially better than the old one. Now, I don't know if that's true here for Poison, but we'll see.
Oh, I agree, and I think that was a good change. Here, though, at least as far as I can tell, the literal only reason they changed it was to remove a click.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't seem like a good reason to make a game design change, to me.
Well, the game designers disagree, so
Agreed.
We'll see. But Toxic in general, we're going to be winning with Death Touch. Now Poison Counters, which is not quite the same thing as Death Touch, right?
It's not at all.
I could see how people would get those two sort of mechanics or
Agreed.
keywords very, very confused. So we're going to keep those things very, very separate. This does not have Death Touch in that way. And it will just be adding poison counters if it connects to an opponent. And it's also important to note, what does that mean for the first strike on this?
doesn't mean a ton because it doesn't do anything to creatures. I mean, it just means, I guess, if you're at 9 poison, you can't let this through before other things happen. But since there aren't really ways to remove poison counters, that doesn't really matter that much whether it's first strike or regular damage.
Agreed. I wonder if it's a thing where... I'm trying to think of something it would be super relevant for, like if your opponent's going to burn you out, but that would be instant speed anyway and can be done before first strike damage resolves.
Yeah.
So I think this is just, a bear with double upside. So I think it's fine. If it was like Death Touch Toxic, that would be pretty interesting, right?
Not really. Those don't really interact at all
with the first strike.
Well, so first strike and death touch.
That's what I'm saying. So it's incentivizing your opponent not to block, which helps you get your toxic counters in.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah.
That's what I meant. Like these two abilities don't necessarily go hand in hand. You would have to add something like Death Touch to it. But toxic, guys, 10 poison counters, and your opponent wins the game. You're essentially cutting their life in half. So it is kind of interesting to note cards that have poison. They give you poison counters based on their toughness. That's why pump spells work really well. Whereas this is Toxic 1, Toxic 2, right?
Cards with Infect.
Infect, that's what, I'm sorry.
I was actually just about to bring that up because someone pointed out in chat that Toxic is to stop pumps. That's right. I was saying not why they use Toxic instead of Infect. That's why my issue is Toxic versus Poisonous, which are basically the same thing. Yeah, Infect is very different because of the pump ability.
Okay, so that's where I was going with this one particularly, is that the Toxic number is to separate it from Poisonous, where it gives you the number of infect counters based on...
It's separated from Infect.
Infect. I keep mixing them up in my head. It's separate from Infect, so that way pump spells will not increase the number of counters that you're getting. So an Infect creature that was a 2/2 would do 2 poison. This is only going to do 1. Now there might be ways to increase the number of toxic, or there are creatures that have more toxic abilities, and there are colors and themes within that increase the toxicity of the various creatures.
Yes, someone just asked a question about toxic stacking. What that means is if this has toxic 1, and if you have some other way of giving it like toxic 2, it would do 3 poison counters because both instances would happen.
Okay,
that was true for Poisonous as well. Infect did not stack.
So this is not like an ability like a normal ability. Like you can't have double Death Touch.
Correct. Infect, for example, did not stack, but it did work with like double strike. It would kind of stack, in that case.
Yes, double strike would make this hit twice,
double strike
right?
Would also work. Yes, double strike would also
happen
here.
So, brief notes. I feel like this is one of the ones we're going to talk the most about for the new mechanics, just because, again, it does have so many sort of iterations, and it is kind of funky that we're used to seeing sort of things with like Death Touch, Poisonous, and Infect, and now Toxic. All of these things sort of like get smushed together in my head, as you guys just saw clearly. So 10 counters, Toxic, it does stack if you're able to give more Toxic, and it is not dependent upon the creature's power. So.
Yeah, and it is not a triggered ability as well.
Okay.
So things like if there's anything that doubles triggers or things like that won't help.
Okay. Sorry, also catching up on chat, because this is like one of the first times chats have been pretty active and helpful here. Toxic isn't a trigger. Someone said toxic is most certainly a triggered ability.
It is not. Poisonous was. That is the key difference between Poisonous and Toxic. I will get the exact rule from the mechanics article, but that is why they changed it. Otherwise, they would just use Poisonous.
Yes.
It's the same mechanic in every...
that is my understanding also.
Yeah, it hands out with the damage, just like Lifelink. Lifelink is not a triggered ability. It just happens at the same time as damage. It does not create a trigger. It is the same. It works the exact same way as that.
The person that's commenting also then said exactly that, so I feel like they might just have a reverse definition of what's triggered and what is not. So we're going to go ahead and move on, though, just to keep it a little bit lighter here. And we're going to now talk about another new ability here in Phyrexia All Will Be One, and that's Corrupted. Corruption, we're going to see on this creature, With the Apostle of Invasion, it's a 4/4 flyer. We're gonna rate these later with Corrupted, and it says as long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, this creature gets double strike. So what Corrupted is it's just an ability keyword that says if an opponent has 3 poison counters, do a thing. So lots of things can be corrupted and they can do different things, but the important thing to note is that the trigger on that is whether or not your opponent has 3 or more poison counters.
Yeah, one of the problems poison counters have always had is that they don't mean anything until the 10th one. Like, the first 9 poison counters don't matter.
Yeah.
And historically, right, they've always a little different maybe right now, but historically, they've been on underpowered creatures.
Yes.
So Corrupted is a way to kind of make poison, or in this case toxic decks, be a little less all in. Like, that you can actually have a kind of a toxic theme without having to kill with toxic. You can actually still get some benefit.
Yeah, because now you're like playing this game of like you just need to get 3 and your creatures get a little bit of a boost and then you can kill them with this 4/4 flyer. Now I will say it does seem like, a 4/4 flyer for 6 mana is not super exciting, right? Especially for a big Phyrexian Angel. But once it gets double strike, then it is, well above rate. So it's similar to, that was actually our argument in the beginning was you didn't like the poison, but I said, but they're weaker creatures, so you get like that nice little balance. So I kind of liked them, but it feels like we're doing the same thing here where we're getting something that's slightly overcosted and then it has the potential to become bigger if your deck has the synergies to support it. So it's an interesting mechanic and I'm looking forward to the set review where we look at all the different like iterations of corruption and see what types of things it can give to the creature, because this double strike one seems awesome.
Yeah, Corrupted, as you can probably just see by the way it's laid out, it doesn't mean anything. Like, there is no corrupted mechanic. It's an ability word that just basically says if or as long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. Note it's an opponent, not so like in Commander, not that we're a Commander thing, but if anybody would have it, then it has double strike or it has first strike, or the follow to the if could be anything.
Did I say something different when I explained
it?
No,
I just like explaining the difference between ability words and mechanics.
Oh, I see.
I just like saying that.
I was like, I thought that's how I explained it, but maybe not.
Maybe it's just I like. Well, whenever we see something like that, I like to bring up the difference between.
Yeah. So.
Keywords. Sorry.
Nope, it's totally fine. If you want, I will let you do that.
No, that's my fault. And yes, it is always 3 poison counters for.
Yes. So basically Corrupted, just in a nutshell, is going to say if an opponent has 3 counters or more, do a thing. Now, we're going to see that in a bunch of different ways, and as we get through the set review, what types of different things they can staple onto these creatures will be really interesting. And we've seen other things like this, like with Coven, for example, where Coven was always triggered by the same mechanic. However, what the creature did once you had Coven was very, very different. And I feel like this is just another iteration that's a lot more flavorful for Phyrexia.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about the next new mechanic. It's for Mirrodin, which is a weird mechanic name.
It has an exclamation point. It's for Mirrodin.
That's true. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I struggle. So what this ability does... Actually, I'll let you take this one, Yanks.
For Mirrodin is on equipment only. And it basically says when this equipment enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 red rebel and attach this equipment to it. We've seen mechanics like this before with Living Weapon, which created germ tokens. The difference being those were 0/0, so they couldn't survive without equipment. We've also seen it more recently with some sort of single cards that created a creature and attached themselves to it.
There was also like a kicker mechanic that was, sort of tacked on the extra cost for this ability, basically. So, this one just happens naturally. So you have like sort of a weaker equipment attached to like a cheaper cost to give you this creature. So it's sort of built into the cost. But like in Keldheim, we did see the bonus sort of kicker, which allowed you to create this creature, which felt very similar as far as the mechanic, but those equipments were a little bit more powerful on their own.
Yeah, and this is coincidentally a red card, but it is always a 2/2 red rebel. That doesn't change no matter what the equipment is.
That's interesting to know. I did not know that. I thought they would have been like a 2/2 of their color type, but that definitely makes sense. I'm wondering how relevant that will be.
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward mechanic. Basically, just has a trigger when it enters the battlefield. If this gets destroyed before it can attach, you still get the rebel. Nothing changes there.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. What do you think overall of this mechanic?
In general, I like things like this. Usually, one of the problems with equipment is you can't put too many of them in your deck because you need to have a critical mass of creatures to attach them to them. But this provides a body, so this will never be a dead card. It might not be a great card if you're staring down like an 8/8, but it never does nothing. It always gives you a body at least.
Yeah. And it's a 2/2 for 2. Like it's a fine rate creature here. We'll see what the other equipments do. Yeah, the difficult thing is that, the more equipments you have in your deck, the lower your creature count's going to be. It means it's less likely they're going to be able to consistently connect those two things together to make an impact. And if you run into like a removal deck, you're in some trouble. So this sort of mitigates that, and I think that that's a really cool thing. I will say that the artifacts have been getting very, very good and a lot more playable in the last few sets. A lot of things we didn't think were playable were good. I remember in Keldheim Yanks, you hated those, and they ended up being very good.
They were good.
Since then, they've been getting more and more playable as the equipments have gone on over the last, 2-3 years.
Yeah, the thing I'm very curious to see on this is what part of the equipment gets taxed in exchange for this extra ability. Is it what the equipment does? Is it the casting cost, or is it the equip cost?
Interesting.
Or is it a mix of the three?
Yeah, here the equip cost seems a little bit high, but First Strike and Trample is pretty good, but it's a little high for a non-stat based change,
Yeah.
But everything here seems well costed to me.
Yeah, in this case, I think it's either they made the equipment cost a little more or they made the effect a little weak for the equip cost. But the base cost seems reasonable. I wonder if we're going to see somewhere it's the base cost that gets inflated.
All right, well, we will see throughout the set, but that is for Mirrodin. Better?
Yes.
All right, so the next one, guys, we're going to talk about another new and our final new mechanic. We're going to talk about it with Trawler Drake. I picked this card because it was my preview card. Thank you, Wizards. # free preview. This is our oil counters mechanic, and this is very, very new. And so a 3-mana Drake with flying, and it says when it enters the battlefield, it comes with an oil counter on it. It gets +1/+1 for each oil counter. And then whenever you cast it on whatever spell, add an oil counter. So its power and toughness go up and up as you accrue oil counters on it. One of the interesting things to note here is that these are not +1/+1 counters. The oil counters themselves are essentially useless. It's the ability text on there that gives the Drake the +1/+1 for those counters. So if you were to have a card that we saw one of these recently, I think in like New Capenna, it was like, deal 1 damage and target creature loses all abilities. That would just kill this no matter how big this is, which is an interesting interaction that I would like to see how oil counters change some of these ways we play the game.
Yeah, there was a pretty funny Twitter meme going around with oil counters and cards like this to get +1/+1 for them, because the developers, once they decided to use oil counters, they couldn't also use +1/+1 counters through their own design rules. And it's like, oh, really? You say I can't use +1/+1 counters? Hold my beer. And you make a card like this that basically does, but technically doesn't.
I didn't know that they couldn't use them with the design rules. What's that?
They have rules on how many different types of counters you can use in any set.
Oh.
One of them, and this doesn't apply here, but I know like they try really hard and possibly don't at all ever use +1/+1 and -1/-1 counters in the same set. Just because people tend to use a die to represent counters, and that would be kind of weird.
Okay, interesting. But we've had like shield counters with +1/+1 counters, so I don't know why we couldn't have oil and +1/+1 specifically. But
I know there's been some posts from some of the developers and designers about like that they should have had a swear jar for the number of times people tried to use +1/+1 counters even though they couldn't.
I do remember that tweet. That was pretty funny. But
so
we found a way to design around it.
Exactly. But yeah, you said the key part of this is that oil counters, they're just a type of counter. It's like a charge counter. It doesn't actually mean anything unless the card says it does.
Absolutely. And there could be a lot of things that could make things get stuff. We'll see when we go through the set, but can you imagine a pump spell that says target creature gets +X/+X, where X is the number of oil counters on it. So, you get these like sort of weird payoffs where you want to be putting oil counters on things and you never quite know how and when those things will necessarily become handy. So I'm excited to see how oil counters play out as a theme.
Agreed. It's also possible the counter thing was they might have just tried to limit, especially the number of types of counters, given that Proliferate was coming back, as we see.
Yep, that definitely makes sense. Oil counters +++1/+1s in a Proliferate set could be a lot.
And poison counters.
And, well, yeah. I mean, those are a little less complicated because they're not on the creature.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be as worried about that one specifically, but...
Agreed.
All right, so the next one we're going to go to, guys, is that's the end of our new mechanics. Let's go ahead and talk about returning mechanics from older sets that you guys might not be used to if you're new to Magic, or if you just might have forgot because, a lot of these mechanics are one and done and then we forget about them. Because I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. So the first one we're going to talk about is Proliferate. We did see this one not too long ago. Which set was it that I'm thinking about where we had like the cool elementally guy? Help me out here, Yanks.
When
was the last time was it War of the Spark? War of the Spark was the one that I remember a ton.
It was in War of the Spark.
Yep.
It was originally in Scars of Mirrodin, and it's come back a couple times since then, but most recently Spark.
Yeah, War of the Spark was the one I was thinking about that was the most recent, and it was a actual real archetype in the format, and that's what we're going to see here. And you'll notice also that it's stapled onto a lot of random things. That's why I went ahead and picked Drown in Ichor. This card says target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, Proliferate. Now 2 mana for -4/-4, I'm already in. I'm playing that. Even if it's sorcery speed, I think this is quite solid. But I also can Proliferate, which will increase poison counters, increase oil counters, increase loyalty counters. It does everything, and it's a nice little bonus that you see stapled onto cards that are probably already playable or will make them playable because the Proliferate itself is more than enough to push it over that playable line.
Yeah, just like you said, it's going on everything. It can be on any type of card. It can be an ability. It can be stapled onto a spell like this one.
You can see it as like ability for planeswalkers and things like that.
Definitely.
There was a Proliferate land not that long ago, so you can see more synergies built up there for constructed.
Yep, Karn's Bastion. It'll be interesting to see how it does in a format that doesn't have +1/+1 or -1/-1 counters.
Well, it kind of does, right? Like, we think oil counters are basically going to be +1/+1 counters in this set. I doubt they're going to have the removal that we saw from Capenna that removed abilities. So... I mean, I think that it's going to just play out the same way it did with +1/+1 counters, but it is a lot more flexible in that oil counters don't necessarily have to be +1/+1. They can be something else.
Yeah, I think they do. I think they do a lot of other things than just +1/+1, but there's definitely at least that cycle.
So, whatever creatures would normally have +1/+1 still kind of do, and then we get also other cool abilities to proliferate onto as well. And another cool thing is, guys, we have more planeswalkers in this set than we have since War of the Spark. There is a rare and a mythic cycle of planeswalkers, and they are good. Holy smokes. You guys will see them when we get to them, but like just the rare planeswalkers alone, I am going to be ripping my hair out in Limited because I'm going to lose to so many of them. I know it.
Yeah, it is not a coincidence that the last time we saw Proliferate was the last time we saw this many planeswalkers.
Yes, and it makes the planeswalkers even better, and they're all so good. Gosh, I didn't mind it last time because a lot of those planeswalkers, like the uncommon ones, were like not that bad. But whew, this new Wandering Emperor is going to be a beast.
The catch with War of the Spark though is they were in every pack.
Yeah. All right, so that's Proliferate, guys. I'm just going to keep us moving along, Yanks, if you have nothing too serious to say.
The only note I would say on Proliferate is you get to pick your targets or your creatures or permanents that have them, but you have to proliferate every type of counter. You don't get to pick and choose on that.
Oh, yes. Okay, when you said that, I was like, you don't have, like, if there's one creature with Yeah, +1/+1, and you have a poison counter, you don't have to do them all. But I misunderstood you at first. If you pick a creature that has poison, let's say a -1/-1, which doesn't exist, and an oil counter, and you choose that creature, it proliferates all the tokens on that creature. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to, everything that's on the board, you have to pick anything like that.
No, you don't have to choose every target, but every target you choose, you have to proliferate everything on it.
Correct. Yes, that makes more sense. All right, so now we're going to go to the next mechanic, which is Phyrexian mana. This is the thing we've seen off and on. We saw it a little bit like in Strixhaven. We had the Tezzeret's Gambit, I believe, was one of the recent ones. And
that was one of the mystical archives there, yep.
Yep, and then I think, was there anything more recent? We didn't have it in the last set, did we?
Well, all the completed planeswalkers.
Yeah. The couple of mythic planeswalkers. I forget because I never see them in limited.
Johnny.
Yes.
In the last set.
So the way Phyrexian mana works, guys, is you can pay the mana cost, or you can pay 2 life to mitigate that cost. So for example, this Jace is 2 blue, but the last blue is a Phyrexian blue, so you can pay 2 blue and 2 life. But that's going to lead us to the sort of next. It's actually kind of a new mechanic here, but we'll get to that. So Phyrexian mana part, Yanks, you got anything to add?
No, not until we move on to the second half of this.
All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is completed. This is kind of new with the Ajani cycle, right? Like we didn't have these before.
Not before recently. I think Tamio might have been the first one.
Yeah. Okay.
Kamigawa.
So the completed Planeswalker just says that if you paid the Phyrexian mana, the 2 life, instead of the mana, the Planeswalker comes in with 2 less loyalty, which is just sort of like a good design mechanic to keep the Planeswalker from being less powerful because you played it a lot earlier. So it sort of takes the Planeswalker down a peg. I still think it's incredibly powerful because when you're playing it that early, oftentimes you can mitigate the loss of loyalty by the fact that your opponent just doesn't have the creatures to block or attack or whatever. So it's sort of a balancing act there. By giving it the Phyrexian mana, it's taking a chunk out of its loyalty, and sometimes being the difference on whether or not you can ultimate or not the Planeswalker the turn it comes in.
Yeah. The one note I want to have is that completed and Phyrexian mana aren't locked in sync, right? The Phyrexian mana part of it is how you pay for it. This completed portion only really applies to these Planeswalkers if it specifically has it. There are a bunch of abilities in the set you can pay for with Phyrexian mana, and that doesn't cause any sort of completed stuff. It just means you can.
Yeah, those two things are completely separate. So the Phyrexian mana is at the top, and then this Planeswalker has the completed ability, which just means if you did pay mana with if you did pay with Phyrexian mana, then you get this triggered ability. But it doesn't necessarily have to happen. Obviously, you can just pay the regular blue source here, and it's not going to be on any of the like spells, instants, and sorceries that have the Phyrexian mana.
Yeah, I'm scanning through. I believe the only cards that have Phyrexian in the casting cost are these Planeswalkers.
That's what I saw when I was looking through it, but I think there was some abilities. Yeah,
there are a bunch of ability costs that you can pay with Phyrexian mana.
Yep. And that's going to get around the completed thing altogether. So this is really just the only thing that we're looking at here that has completed. And that's it for returning mechanics. The next thing we're going to touch on is the cycles in the set, and we're going to kind of cruise through this because, you know, we're getting up there in time. I want to keep this a little short. So we're seeing the return of the fast lands. I went ahead and picked the Blackcleave Cliff because I know that this thing shot up in price for a while. I think it's come back down to earth a little bit. But yeah, these lands are a complete cycle that we're going to see throughout the set. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer lands. We just recently got the slow lands that came into play if you had more. So these are pretty nice as far as like collection building and making sure you guys have in your collection. And again, I think some of these really got up in price for a bit.
Yeah, I feel like this one specifically was up to like $60 or $70 at one point.
Oh my God. I picked him up for like 15 for my deck, and I think I sold him at like 45, feeling like I made out like a bandit.
Yeah, they printed first in Scars of Mirrodin, so it's appropriate that we see them now that we're back in New Phyrexia, which was Mirrodin, so we're back on that plane, so we get to go to the same location and get the fast lands again.
Yep. So a much welcomed reprint for the constructed players in the house for sure. All lands, always good to pick up in limited, so we're happy to see them. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the Twilight cycle. This is a callback to the Zenith cycle, and each color has its own Twilight card. I'm going to let Yanks develop on those a little bit more. I think you'll know a little bit more about the Zenith cycle stuff than I do.
Yeah, so in Scars of Mirrodin block, you had a Black Sun, Blue Suns, etc. Zenith cycle. And it's kind of a little bit of a lore-based set of cards. Mirrodin has 5 suns, one of each color, and Mirrodin's an artificial plane, and really they're just balls of that color mana that exploded kind of out of the center of the planet through creating giant things called lacunae, which is how kind of you could travel between through the interior of the plane that has been completely kind of redesigned. Phyrexia has taken over, but yeah, it's just kind of a callback. They were all like some amount of colorless plus X. They didn't quite have. This isn't quite the same as Zenith cycle. One thing people remember from the Zenith is they all shuffled back into your deck after you played them.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't do that, but I think it's just nice to have a set of X spells that are one for each color. Just a little bit of a throwback to those.
Yeah, I like the color. I like cycles in general. I think the Zeniths were a lot more powerful. Like I don't, from what I saw, I don't think any of these are going to break some stuff like we did with the last set.
Yeah, I mean, Green Sun Zenith is absurdly strong card.
Yeah.
We'll see legacy play. Black Sun and Blue Sun. Blue Sun was a kill condition because it was a targeted draw spell, so you can mill your opponent out with it. Black Sun Zenith was a pretty good card. I don't think White and Red really saw much play, but
these in general seem more tame.
Yeah, agreed. They definitely don't have the power level of those.
But it's nice to see the good callback to it. I love cycles, regardless of what they're necessarily referencing. But I think this is definitely a good thing to go back to. The next one we're going to talk about is the Skull Bomb cycle. And again, another callback to the spell bombs that we had before. Each color has its own thing. They do something sort of similar. They all can be played and cycled for a draw, or they can be played, you pay a little bit more mana, you still get to draw a card, and then they do something a little bit unique depending on the color that they come from. For example, white is, a lot of combat tricks, and this one does a little bit of a Mighty Leap effect, +2/+2 in flying. We'll rate them later. But then, each one kind of follows suit and does something based on the color that they're in.
Yeah, spell bombs were from original Mirrodin, so we get them back again, another trip to Mirrodin. They all did that same thing, like you said. You can pay 1 to draw a card. The interesting difference on these is 2 differences. One is the other ability, so that the non-just cycle ability has different casting costs. And that first cycle, they all were 1 mana to do something, or 1 mana to cycle, or 1 of a specific color to do an ability. These are generally more expensive, but also in this case, even the second ability still lets you draw a card, which the other one force you to choose between cycling or getting an ability.
Yeah, overall they seem pretty strong. Like, because you have that option to do both, and like a Mighty Leap draw card seems pretty good. Now they are face up. It kind of takes away the combat trick aspect of it, but it also replaces itself, which feels like a solid playable.
Yeah, as long as you're willing to pay a little bit more mana and do it at sorcery speed, because all of them can only be done at sorcery speed for the second ability. You still get the card, which seems like a nice flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, moving on to the next cycle, we have the Dominus cycle. It's a big pile of mythics. In every single color, they're the mythic Phyrexian gods, and they all have a static ability, plus an activated ability which allows you to kind of protect themselves with indestructible counters. What are you thinking about this cycle?
I think it's kind of the way they're trying to do Phyrexian gods. Phyrexians are kind of artificial, so they really wouldn't have sort of like a god, so this is sort of like your god at home.
That was the whole thing with Battlestar Galactica, right? The things all had this crazy god they were robots, right?
I have no idea what you're talking.
Anyway, that's what this is. This is Battlestar Galactica, guys. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Someone in the chat has to know what I'm talking about here.
The interesting thing to me on this cycle is the all of those abilities are one and then double Phyrexian of the color, and you have to kind of in an interesting way the way Phyrexians work. It kind of costs you more to get less here. Like in this case, you have to discard 2 cards to get an indestructible counter. Another one, it's sacrifice 2 things or remove 3 counters. It's sort of a little bit cannibalistic almost.
There's some chat about Battlestar. So you guys remember the guy? He had the girl in his head, the hot chick, that she was a god at the end, and she would do dirty stuff to him in his head. Okay, here we are. We've reached that territory. Overall, I think these feel very much like the other gods that we saw, but those came with indestructible. So
yeah, to me, it's kind of like they're trying to mimic gods, which is the way kind of Phyrexians work. They don't really create; they sort of consume and mimic like actual life.
I like that you also have to discard 2 cards for this, like the other gods that we've seen from like Theros that just come into play with indestructible. I'm not a huge fan of. They do feel very strong to me. So this, you have to pay some mana. You could pay life instead for most of it, which is nice. But you also have to discard these cards, and that makes me very happy. It's a nice balancing effect. It's already a 5/4 creature for 4 mana and does some other stuff. This is about on par with what I would like to see for a cycle, and I'm okay with getting beaten down by this once in a while, and I do feel like it's beatable.
Yeah, agreed.
I'm excited to see how many indestructible or how many exiling effects there are in the set as well, because I would love to have my opponent discard 2 cards to do this so that they can presumably beat me in the face forever, and I'll just exile it, and it'll feel so good. It'll bring me much joy. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the final cycle in the set, and that is going to be the Spheres. This is a common cycle of 9 lands, 4 colorless, 5, 1 of each color, and they basically, the colored ones all can sacrifice to draw a card. We saw something like this in Strixhaven. No, Strixhaven was Scry. The one that drew was Capenna?
Capenna.
Yeah, where you use them as lands for a little while. Great, you move along. They enter the battlefield tapped, which, makes for some longer games, and the card draw also makes for some longer games, but they're a nice resource to have. And then it's got the cycle of 4 colorless lands that are rare and all do different things. These are supposed to sort of like represent the 9 spheres of Phyrexia.
Yeah, so sort of a little bit of lore. The original Phyrexia was a artificial plane of 9 spheres. Supposedly each one kind of more terrifying as you got deeper and deeper, which, I kind of assume that's supposed to be like a veiled reference to Dante's Inferno and the 9 circles of hell. But Mirrodin being, or now New Phyrexia, they've kind of torn the plane apart, which was just an original sort of outer surface and an inner core, and turned it into New Phyrexia, 9 spheres. And there's 1 sphere for each praetor, which you see the 5, the Fair Basilica being Elishnorns, and I think it's something maze for Vorinclex, and there's 1 for each of the 5 colored ones. And then there's the 4 colorless ones, which are complete the 9. So it's kind of like a cycle within a cycle.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what these lands do for the format. I feel like when we have these sorts of redraw mechanics, it makes for some more interesting gameplay, and good for deck building, I think.
For deck building, it's pretty cheap to activate, too, which is nice. Sometimes the draw card ones cost, I think, like the new Capenna ones cost like 3 or 4.
Yeah. It makes for more complicated gameplay, which I'm always a big fan of.
Yep.
That's it for cycles, guys. The last thing we want to touch on for this episode, and we're going to skim over them kind of quickly because we are getting up there in time, is the archetypes. So we're briefly just going to go over what the theme of each color pair is. I feel like in this set, they're a lot more generic than they are in some, but most of the sets are pretty generic. That's why these color pairs have the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? whatever. There's a reason why we associate certain things with colors, and that's because most often that is the case, and that is going to be here. We're not going to be breaking down walls in this set. So first we'll talk about Azorius, the white-blue. It is artifact control.
Yeah, artifact control, artifacts matter. This is kind of a classic white-blue archetype. Whenever you go to a Mirrodin or an artifact world, you tend to see this. You saw this in one of the Modern Masters sets too. I think it was Modern Masters 15. White-blue is a heavy sort of affinity style.
Yep, I do remember archetype.
That. So, nothing outrageous, nothing crazy, but a pretty common and usually well supported when you get to one of these sets.
And I picked this card. There's some synergy here where the power is based on the number of artifacts you control. So it's, again, really going to be rewarding you for that synergy that you're going to see a lot in this color pair. The next one is going to be blue-black. This is a crazy, crazy card, which we will be rating very highly later. But this is the blue-black Corrupt and Proliferate control. So we're going to be doing a lot of toxic, corruption, and proliferating the counters on them. Yeah, this card is an absolute beast.
Yeah, blue-black is kind of one of the archetypes. There are a couple that seem to overlap with sort of a corrupted, toxic, proliferating theme. This is blue-black's supposed to be a pretty controlling version of that.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the black-red. This is a sacrifice mechanic. Surprise, surprise, that's exactly what we saw with Brothers War and most other sets. So there are artifacts and creatures, and we're going to be doing a bunch of things with sacrificing. So I went ahead and picked the Char Forger, which is creating tokens when it comes into play, and whenever a creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard, put an oil counter. So again, it's just sort of helping to fuel your sacrifice and reward you for sacrificing. So it's a pretty neat mechanic, and I tend to like these decks. So I'm excited to see what red-black can do here.
Yeah, black-red sacrifice pretty often. The biggest evolution in it recently it's been a lot of times it's not just creatures, it's creatures and/or artifacts, which certainly makes sense in a Phyrexia set.
Absolutely. All right, moving on to red-green. Here are your oil counters. So you want to put a ton of oil counters onto your permanents. So this guy is a 5/5 with vigilance, and he costs one less for each permanent you control with an oil counter on it. So he doesn't have himself have like a big ability with those oil counters, but he comes down cheaper, and when he enters the battlefield, he deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. So overall, just a way to get a very cheap 5/5 in play if you have high synergy in your deck with these oil counters.
Yeah, Gruul has this oil counter synergy this time. It's mostly your kind of big basic stompy deck otherwise with that little oil counter twist.
Yep. So I'm interested to see, like, some creatures might get +1/+1 if they have oil counters, plus you have big fatties coming down when you have oil counters. So it should just be a nice synergy, and we'll see how well it comes together for it. Let's go ahead and do Selesnya next, the green-white. Green-white is going to be the go wide and toxic. I wasn't expecting toxic here. I was expecting go wide, but it makes sense that we want to have something here. Green I would expect to be a little bit more toxic, but not so much in the white. What do you think about the color pairing here?
Yeah, I think this is one of the times where your sort of gold color pair is like a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B instead of where they both share an ability. So you get the poison from green and or toxic from green and the go wide from white.
Yeah, but usually we do see those abilities sort of leach into both sides of whatever that gold color card is. So I would expect to still see a fair amount of toxic cards in white based on what we've been seeing from the most recent sets.
Yeah, I think you will. I think you're talking Phyrexia, everything's toxic.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting to see that this is a 2/2 for 2 that has Toxic 2, which is pretty important. And whenever you have another creature you control that attacks with Toxic, it gets +1/+1 until turn. So, like, it's doing a lot of things. It feels like this creature is well above rate. It's going to be hitting very hard, and it's going to be hitting with Toxic. So you're going to be kind of going wide, going tall, and cutting your opponent's life total in half, possibly. So pretty interesting mechanic. I'm excited to see how many white cards are in Toxic for white to support. So we'll see.
Agreed. There's definitely going to be some as we look into our next color pair, because black-white, in this case, their theme is corrupted. So white better be providing some counters
Yes.
if you want corrupted to be your theme.
Yeah, so that makes sense, right? If you're in the Selesnya side of things, you're not necessarily killing them with those those corruption poison counters. You're just sort of applying them to help like bolster like your green cards that come into play cheaper and do those kinds of things. Whereas in this color pairing, in the white-black, you're going to be using those white cards to enable some of the just enough counters to get corruption to then activate and make all of your creatures more powerful. This one in particular says if you have corrupted, or if one of your opponents is corrupted, if one of your opponents has more than 3 counters, this is corrupted. And it has 3 or more poison counters. Destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls when it enters the battlefield. So this is definitely a late game creature you're not going to want to play super quickly because you want to make sure you get those poison counters. A 4/4 vigilance for 5 mana that ETBs kills a thing, that is very powerful.
Yeah, one thing I'm going to want to see, because I think they've only ever printed one card that has ever been able to remove poison counters. So I'd be curious to see if we get any more of that in this set, because that could be a big deal with Corrupted if you can, especially at instant speed, go from 3 to 2 or something.
Yeah, I can't imagine that we're going to see much of that just because it's never really been supported before. But the fact that, like you were saying, poison counters are usually dead until you get to 10. The rest don't matter. Here they do. So I feel like that this would be a good spot to sort of put something in there, like maybe a planeswalker ability that removed a poison counter or something. Would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the Is It combo here. We have the blue-red, and what blue-red is trying to do is spells matter. It has a lot of oil counters, and it can generate a lot of oil counters like we saw with the Drake. That was my preview card. Whenever you played a non-creature spell, you got an oil counter. And so these color pairings are going to be doing a lot of things with those oil counters.
Yeah, like red-green was an oil counter pair, but for the most part, and there's going to be some overlap, but for the most part, it cared about like how many things you had oil counters, where blue-red a lot of times is going to care about having multiple or several counters, and it's going to generate those from its non-creature spell.
Yeah, this is a cool thing where we're seeing again where you have oil counters in red, but green, pairing it with green, you really want to have them to enable big drops and things like that. Whereas here you want to have more counters to enable other things like buffs and bonuses. So it's really, really cool that they're able to put the same mechanic in a color and have it play very, very differently depending on what your color pairing is.
Yeah, it's an interesting take on the old, like, you can go wide or go tall type of thing. In this case, you can go wide with oil counters, which is more your red-green, or you can try to stack up many of them to get a bonus like you can here in the blue-red side.
Yep. Spells matter. Not surprising to see for blue-red. Let's go ahead and move on to the black-green. This is big and toxic, exactly what we would expect to see. We've been paired with green earlier, and we did see some toxic cards, and green is going to have a lot more of the larger creatures. And so we have a 1/5 here with toxic. So again, not death touch. So you're not going to be guaranteed to get in, but it's 1 power with 2 toxic. That's kind of unique. And then you can pay 3 target creature you control with toxic gains death touch until end of turn. What a nice bonus when you've got a big fat booty. We'll rate them later. It's so hard not to rate them. So we've got these big tall creatures, and we've got a lot of death touch synergies and ways to make the toxic creatures have death touch to really get in a lot of extra damage, because your opponents, they're not going to want to block this with their 3/3, and you can activate at instant speed. Boom, you get yourself a toxic counter, and that can add up very quickly.
Yeah, I think this pairing, along with maybe blue-green, which we haven't looked at yet, are probably the ones that are actually trying to kill you with poison the most, as opposed to just using the counters to get other bonuses.
Yes, I think that's right. This is not going to be the one that's going to be working with Corrupted. I think that's more in the white category.
Yeah.
But it's also important to note that the emiddle ability on this, every time this hits you, it's going to do 3.
Yeah.
Right? Toxic 2 plus 1?
Correct. Yep.
Ooh, this is going to hurt. You're going to have to block this, and it's going to suck.
Yep, and it can target itself
yes,
with its ability. So
absolutely.
1/5 with death touch is tough to block.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got to double block it, and they get to kill your best thing. And if you don't, you're just on barely a 3-turn clock. Oh boy. All right, now we've got the red-white. The red-white is sort of the equipment mechanic. They've got a lot of 4 Mirrodin stuff, and bit go wide, aggro, Boros do Boros things.
Yep, this is kind of very common Boros archetype. Also fits the story of the set very well. Red white is kind of the alignment of the rebels, and red, even red, Phyrexia's Red Praetor and Urabrask is kind of on their side, so, or at least rebelling from Elishnorn, so fits.
Ooh, I can't wait till we get into the story and hear a little bit more about the characters as we meet them. Yanks with story time is back. I'm excited. All right, the final archetype here is the green-blue. This is the proliferate and poison counters. I expect to see exactly that from Simic. It is 100% what I expect and what I wanted to see. So we've got a little flying toxic creature here, 3 mana for a 2/3 with toxic. That's quite impressive stats. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield, excuse me, little dry spot there, you may pay 2 if you do proliferate. Each creature, ETBs, with a bonus tax of 2 mana to proliferate. That seems very, very powerful. And this has toxic, so you hit for 2, poison 1, and then you play a creature next turn and you get to proliferate, add a poison counter. So now you're poisoning twice as quickly.
Yeah, black-green was looking to try to kill you with poison by, like, smacking you for 4 or 5 poison at a time. Blue-green is going to be much kind of slower and controlling, where they just want to get that first poison counter on you. And then, yeah, they'll try to add more with combat damage, but they're going to pretty much slowly get there with proliferate.
And I feel like that's the scarier one, to be honest. So, like, the big green one, I can put stuff in front of it, I can block it, I can remove them. Whereas it feels like this, it's like, okay, well, once I get a poison counter on me, a lot of the stuff in their deck is going to be built around being able to add to that counter without actually having to connect. And I feel like that is a ticking clock that's super scary sometimes.
Yeah, I think black-green might, depending on what we see, might be able to get you out of nowhere every once in a while, but blue-green, you're just going to see it coming and not be able to stop. And that's miserable.
So just briefly, and we haven't even looked at the cards yet, Yanks, and you have a heads up on this because I think you probably looked at the set more than I did already. What do you think is going to be the best archetype? Just give us a random thought.
I like this one, this blue-green. I have not seen a ton of the cards, but it's kind of more of a style I like to play. And proliferate it's one of those that just kind of slowly gets better and better, and unless you've got some really aggressive decks, it's going to be hard to beat this in a late game.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to like Simic just because it has been kind of underwhelming and limited in a lot of sets. It's either, I feel like 80% of the time it's the worst thing you could be doing. And then, 10% of the time it's the absolute best thing above all of the other best things in other sets. So it's so, polar sides of the spectrum for me. So I always kind of just think Simic is going to be pretty underwhelming. I'm going to say Orzhov is going to be good. I think these corrupted cards are going to be insane.
Yeah, I think the other one that kind of just scares me looking at the theme is blue-white, because a lot of times artifact synergies just tend to get out of control fast.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of cheap ones in the set with, like, this, the Skull Bomb cycle you could play in any colors because you can always cycle them, and in a set that color paired actually wants them, they might just want them to sit on the battlefield to get the bonus, and then you get a free cycle.
Very, very true. All right. Well, we will see when we get to the end of the set review, what we'll reassess those guesses in the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're on the YouTube channel, make sure you guys check out our next video. We will be going over white, and we'll be rating them from 1 to 5 for a limited deck. And I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Leave us a comment down below and let us know what you think of Phyrexia All Will Be One. See you guys next time. I'd like to end this video with a special thank you to those of you guys who have signed up for my Patreon. Without my wonderful patrons, none of this content would be possible. If you'd like to support this content and get your name up on the Wall of Fame, you can sign up for our Patreon by using the link down below in the description. Another way you can support the channel is by using code MNG5 with Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find cool stuff in stock. They have everything you need for Magic, board games, and any of your other nerdy hobbies.